All right, everyone. We weren't able to get a recording of lecture from Friday, so we're going to use this video to just get you caught up if you weren't able to make it to that lecture. So before we jump into the adolescence lecture, just wanted to finish up with a note here on attachment. We had talked about in Wednesday's lecture the strange situation paradigm and how Ainsworth developed this to look at and start to differentiate between secure, avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized forms of attachment in young children based on watching how these kids reacted when a parent or caregiver was there, when a stranger came in the room, swapping out the stranger for the parent, back and forth, and doing these, so putting watching the child's behavior through some of these different scenarios. Now, we had talked about what type of behavior was qualified as indicating secure, avoidant, ambivalent attachment. But the important thing to think about here and remember is that when we're thinking about attachment and how this relates to people's later relationships and relationship functioning, again, there's a correlation. It's not super strong, but sort of it's there. But remembering that attachment and how children interact with others thought to be an interaction of both their temperament and their environment. So temperament is that sort of what we're sort of born with, right? Some kids are born and they're just kind of easy kids. They're sort of pretty laid back and easygoing. Some children a little bit more fussy, anxious, may have some difficulties. But what we see is that sort of the extent to which children start to become comfortable with other people, believed to be not just based on temperament or how they were grown up, but an interaction of the two. So if I'm a good baby or a good child and I'm easygoing, I'm fun to be around, it's likely that other people will want to be around me because I'm easygoing, which gives me more exposure to other adults, which makes me even better at just being around people. And so we've got this interaction of temperament, just me being an easygoing kid, and that lending itself to others wanting to be around me more, which then makes me more easygoing and better being around other people and more comfortable, and sort of building on that, right? We can also think of the opposite situation if we're working with a child who's sort of anxious, kind of fussy, very particular. If that's me, it's possible that other people won't want to be around me so much because I'm kind of a difficult child. And if that's what's going on, if I'm difficult and I have a hard time being around other people, that is likely to mean that a lot of other people won't want to be around me, which gives me less opportunities to start to develop those skills, comfort being around other people, which then may exacerbate my fussiness. And so we see these types of feed-forward cycles, right? And so again, just an example of how sort of biological temperament, sort of just kind of what I'm born with, interacts with my environment to facilitate some of these types of things. So again, going back to some of the stuff that we worked on, the behavioral genetics or the epigenetics, talking about sort of these interactive effects, that's what's kind of going on here in attachment as well. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're going through and taking a look at this, and always take a look at the lecture summary, comprehension check slides available on the copies of the slides that you have on WIO courses. Okay. All right. Going to transition in then and talk about adolescence. Okay. When we're talking about adolescence, different changes going on. Obviously, some continued physical development as children reach adolescence. Adolescence marked by the onset of puberty. What we see is the development of primary sex characteristics in both young men and women. This is going to be the development of reproductive organs in both the young men and women. Also seeing the continued development of the onset of secondary sex characteristics. This is going to be in males, facial hair, deepening of the voice, as secondary sex characteristics in males. In females, formulation of breasts and hips. So these are going to be the secondary sex characteristics that come on with puberty. In puberty, we're also going to see menarche in women or young women. This is going to be the first menstrual period. Also spermarchy in males, the first ejaculation. Okay, so keeping all of these things in mind that this is going on as we hit puberty. Onset of puberty and timeline for puberty varies widely across individuals. If we think about your high school years, which many of you will not be far out from your high school years or middle school years, things along those lines. Probably had people who you knew who started to develop much earlier than other people. Other people are late bloomers. Puberty sort of generally thought to begin anywhere between as early as 10, as late as 16. Again, onset of puberty, particularly for young women, starting to become earlier and earlier. We don't know why exactly, but huge variability in terms of onset of puberty. Okay. We also see through adolescence continued neurological development. Again, your brain, if you're in that 18 to 22-year-old range, maybe if you're on the high end of that, but sort of brain continues to develop through young adulthood, okay, or emerging adulthood, kind of this transition between adolescence and adulthood, which is where the majority of you are going to fall. So again, continued synaptic pruning. Those pathways in the brain are going to start to become more efficient. Those ones that are used a lot, starting to get more and more efficient. Those connections that are not used, those getting faded out and sort of becoming less strong. So again, this is just think about synaptic pruning as increased efficiency of the brain to make it leaner, meaner. Okay. We also see some ongoing maturation of very specific brain regions, particularly in the frontal lobes. Okay, remember that your frontal lobes, this is where a lot of executive processes happen. Okay, this is going to be impulse, sort of focused attention, inhibiting impulses and things along these lines, right? The reason that you don't fly off the handle when anything makes you upset or act spontaneously on anything that pops into your head is a lot of that frontal lobe activity, okay? And we see frontal lobes continuing to mature through the mid-20s. And again, if we think about the frontal lobes being important for things like impulse control and directed behavior, this is why we see in adolescence a great deal of impulsivity, heightened emotional experience. Again, because you think about your frontal lobes as kind of your brakes on behavior. It keeps you from just sort of acting on whatever happens to be going through your head at any time. And if those regions aren't developed and mature enough, or haven't yet reached full maturity in adolescence, this is why, again, we see some of that impulsivity, sort of some pretty intense mood swings that you may have seen or experienced yourself at some point in time. This is also a reason why abstinence programs, things like DARE or abstinence-only programs, don't have any efficacy. They just don't work. You're essentially asking people to do something that they have specific deficits in, right? Controlling your behavior, not acting on impulse. Not that you couldn't do it. It's just much, much harder for adolescents. And again, a lot of that is tied in with continuing development, again, of those frontal lobes. So we're seeing physiological influences on behavior in adolescence. We also see continuing influence of environment. Okay. Now, some things we'll highlight here, those early childhood experiences. The extent to which you had sort of strong, responsible caregivers who provided you with attention, good opportunities to interact socially, educational opportunities, and then just basic needs, stuff like food, nutrition, protection from danger and unsafe situations. Again, those early childhood experiences where kids came from, starting to impact, seeing clear influences on behavior as children transition into adolescence. We also see the family environment continuing to shape behavior. When we're looking at research, looks like things like family values, your work ethic, different religious, political beliefs, educational attainment, how individuals interact with people in authority. These are factors that look like they're pretty heavily tied to family environment. So how your mother, father, brother, sisters, so that family culture in terms of values, belief systems, and things along those lines start to influence sort of those same types of behaviors in individuals as they reach adolescence. Okay, but we also see that peer group starts to have a big impact on things like how you socially interact and cooperate with others, how you relate to other people, sort of different types of norms and things along those lines, lifestyle choices, what kind of clothes you wear, what music you listen to, whether or not you smoke or use substances, things along those lines, heavily influence in adolescence by your peer group. Okay, so once again, when we're thinking about the development of you, if this is you, okay, what we see is the interaction of environmental influences to start to develop your behavior or how you interact with others at any point in time. So, and again, let's say I have my family's pretty tight. They keep close tabs on me and what I'm doing and things like that. If that's the case, that's probably going to influence the type of friend group that you hang out with, right? If there are sort of bad influences out there and I have my parents keep pretty good tabs on me, it's going to start to probably limit the amount of time that I can spend with those sort of bad influence peers, let's say. However, if I have my family's a little bit more permissive, my parents don't keep close tabs on me, then it's quite possible that I hang out with certain peer groups, things along those lines. Not necessarily, but what we see again as we're working through all of this, it's not just an additive 1, 2, 3, 4. Sort of where I'm getting sort of my family dynamic and my family culture is going to impact probably the types of friends I'm going to be hanging around, and all these things working together to determine who I am as a person and how I interact with other people and sort of my beliefs and values and things along these lines. Okay. So again, quite complicated in terms of sort of how all this works together. So we've got biological influences, we've got family and sort of immediate environment influences. We also have culture. Okay. When we're talking about culture, we broadly think about culture as a collection of shared ideas, attitudes, behaviors, traditions passed along sort of one group to the next group, to the next group, to the next group. Okay. Now, when we're thinking about culture, we generally think sort of generally the first thing that comes to mind is sometimes a lot of like racial ethnic culture, right? Or big like country culture types of things, right? So we think about American culture or Hispanic culture or Asian American culture or something along those lines, right? Japanese culture, something sort of these sort of big sort of regions, right? Which is good, and that's a good. Those are good examples of culture, right? But what we also see is sort of as we go through and look at this, we can start to get increasingly down to some very specific nuanced cultures, right? So I might have sort of different types of music cultures. Or if you're in university, your chosen area of study may have a specific culture. Again, in class, I talked about, this is where I started as in an engineering program. An engineer culture is a very different culture than, say, English culture, if I'm in lit or philosophy or something along those lines, right? We can have, basically think about any high school teen movie that you've ever watched, right? Where you've got this group of kids and this group of kids and this group of kids. So we can see cultures going from something that's very, very specific, like sort of jock culture or something like that, right? Or some sort of specific music culture, all the way to like Indian culture or something along those lines, right? So again, any type of group where we start to see attitudes, behaviors, traditions passed along from one group to the next, we can identify this as a culture, right? And one of the things we see that's important to culture are this idea of norms, okay? Norms are the rules for expected and accepted behavior. We don't ever get these. They're not ever explicit. Norms aren't ever laid out to us in a worksheet where we get to go through and learn the norms. What we do is we learn the norms by violating those norms and sort of then getting negative feedback because of that, right? So for example, if, say, I were to show up to class, if we're teaching in person class, and I were to show up in I don't know, German lederhosen, right? Like short, sort of German shorts, like from that you see on like beer steins and things along those lines. That would be a strange thing, right? Because what I would have done there is I would have violated a norm for sort of Western Rocky Mountain region, like what's appropriate for professors to show up for class in, right? Or let's say I'm someone's telling me a sad story or something bad that's happened to that day, and I grin the whole time and nod my head enthusiastically. That would be a weird thing. You would notice that would be a weird thing because it would violate a norm. Normative behavior, if someone's telling us in our culture something sad or something that's difficult that's been happening to them, is to reflect some of that type of emotion that other person is talking about. But what I would do if I'm just sort of grinning and sort of nodding at somebody, I violated a norm that's expected social behavior. Okay. And so there's all sorts of norms, right? And we don't notice them. They kind of go undetected because they're just kind of normal until we get a violation. If someone violates a norm, we know that and recognize that because that's not how we do things in our culture, right? But the thing that's important to remember is that culture isn't static. Culture continues to change as we move forward, right? Things change, we adapt, sort of different stuff sort of morphs into other stuff, which is why, people will say, oh, it was sort of, this is someone, each generation is always like, oh, back in my day, sort of this was X, Y, or Z, right? But this is failing to recognize that cultures shift, things change. We all get nostalgic about things, how things were when we were kids. But sort of what we're reacting to is the fact that culture across the world changes and shifts and moves and things along these lines. And so recognizing that even though culture is a big top-down influence, culture is always changing in subtle ways. The culture that we have today, very different than the culture that we had, say, 40 years ago when I was born in 1980. Things look different. Some things are the same, but some things are different. And if I were to play by 1980 rules today, it would seem very strange. If I were to play by 2020 rules in 1980, it would seem very strange, right? Because there would be subtle norm violations, okay? So how we interact, how we develop, hugely impact not only by our biology, by our families, by our peer group, but culture overall. So when we're looking at cultures and thinking about major divisions in culture, people who study this will broadly identify or have broadly identified culture into kind of two baskets. Individualistic cultures, or cultures that are based on individualism, what we see is a priority of the individual over the collective whole. What we see in individualistic countries, countries like a lot of Western countries, the U.S., Canada, sort of Western Europe. Sort of these are countries and communities, populations that are generally identified as having an individualistic culture. What we see here is I identify myself. My sense of me is based on the things that I see that are unique about me, or things that I feel are sort of make me a very, very special, unique flower, different than anybody else. No one else in the world could be exactly like me, right? This is kind of the viewpoint and the approach of an individualistic culture. On the other hand, we have different cultures that we identify as more collectivist, or sort of operate on collectivism. In these cultures, what we see is people identifying themselves or sort of defining themselves as part of a larger whole. In these communities, we start to see a greater prioritization, or a somewhat greater prioritization of what's good for the group over sort of what my personal preferences are right now at any given point in time, or something along these lines, right? And so here we're talking about oftentimes East Asian cultures will get identified as collectivist cultures, some cultures within South America and Africa. And what we see here is me it's not what I'm about and sort of my personal preferences and my own nuances that make me special and unique, and that's what makes Josh Josh. Josh is what defines Josh is based on sort of my role as an instructor, as a professor, as someone who goes through and sort of helps with education or research or sort of whatever it is that I've identified myself. Or I am sort of what makes me me and identifies me is my role in my family, sort of the part I work and sort of the roles I play there. We start to see a greater emphasis on the collective whole as opposed to the individual in collectivist societies. Okay, but it's important to recognize that even though, and research has established very, very clear difference between this is an individualistic culture, this is a collectivist culture, that even though we do see very clear differences, right, in sort of how people view the world, operate, view themselves as individuals, important to recognize that within a culture, right, we can have wide variability in how people act, behave, and things along these lines. Okay, so if I were to meet an international student from China. Okay, this is going to be a country that's generally identified more along the collectivist tradition. I might think some things about this person, but having to recognize that even within that culture, people vary quite a bit, right? Or if someone meets me and they're from a different culture, right? They say, oh, this is an American, this is an individualistic culture. It's very possible that I identify more as a collectivist. I identify myself as part of who I am, as part of the greater whole. And so remembering that even though we have these broad distinctions, within an individual society, we can have all sorts of variability in terms of how people operate, view themselves, things along those lines. Okay. In class, we got into a cool discussion about sort of heuristics, which we'll get into down the road, sort of these shortcuts that we take about inferring things from people, which aren't necessarily bad, but recognizing that even though we have broad knowledge about sort of how certain groups operate, important to recognize that within an individual culture, we have some variability there. All right. These few slides, we're going to talk about Erickson. You don't need to memorize Erickson's stuff, right? Erickson's, we have an investigator called Erik Erikson, and he put together a stage theory of social development. Now, at the time, we had Piaget, and Piaget had his stage theory of cognitive development, right? And so at this point in time, is mid-century, mid-20th century, people were getting sort of pretty excited about these stage theories. Piaget was a pretty big influence. But if you remember, Piaget's stage theory of cognitive development stops at about like age 12-ish, right? Erikson started to get interested in how we develop socially. How do we develop as sort of people? And sort of what starts to influence our goals in how we sort of our goals, our values, not just through childhood, but on into old age. Okay. And so what was interesting about Erikson's approach was he was one of the first researchers in psychology to recognize that, we don't stop developing in adulthood, right? We continue on through life, the things that are important to us, the things that we emphasize, the things that we're interested in, how we navigate our relationships continues to change and develop. Okay, and so what Erikson did some research with some indigenous tribes, looking at the influence of culture on goals and values. And what Erikson did with this and a lot of Freudian stuff, started to put together a stage theory of social development. And the idea is that across people, across all cultures, what we see are distinct universal stages of social development that occur continuing over the course of the lifespan. And so in Erikson's model, we've got 8 different life stages, and each one of these stages involves a psychosocial crisis where we have to have some sort of resolution. If I resolve that, think of these as Herculean tasks. If I resolve that challenge at that life stage, then I'm good. Then I'm going to go on and have healthy relationships and things along those lines. But if I don't, if I have an unsuccessful resolution or I fail what I'm going to have or could have is some reoccurring problem that continues and follows me throughout development. Okay, so again, what Erikson did is say, okay, so Piaget's got this stage theory of cognitive development. Maybe we'll have a stage. Maybe I can develop a stage theory of social development. So a really good idea, right? And sort of asking the right questions. And we credit Erikson for recognizing that we don't just stop developing at sort of after childhood, and then we're just the same people all over, right? If my goals as a 40-year-old professor were the same social goals as an 18-year-old undergraduate, I'd probably have some problems in this culture, right? It would suggest that I haven't sort of developed sort of appropriately, right? So we credit Erikson for recognizing that as we continue through life, we have sort of different goals, themes, and things like that. Problem is there's not a lot of evidence or support for Erikson's theory. So while it's a cool idea, it doesn't look like it actually maps onto what actually happens or how people experience it. But so just wanting you to recognize sort of the benefits of Erikson, why we're going to talk about him, but not actually worry about the actual theory. So just to give you an idea, so example in Erikson's theory, the first stage is in infancy, this idea of trust versus mistrust. The challenge here is to develop trust for parents, caregivers who are caring, affectionate, reliable. And so if I have caring, affectionate, reliable caregivers, then I'm able to develop this sense of trust. But Erikson said if I don't, if I have parents who are cold or distant, or I'm neglected in some way, what's going to happen is then I'm going to have problems. I could have problems with mistrust throughout my life because I failed to achieve trust in this sort of first year of life. Okay, same thing, early childhood. Here, age 1 to 3, Erikson said sort of the primary challenge or the goal was to develop the sense of autonomy through independence and control over my physical abilities. I can move my arm, I can move my leg, I can run or walk, I can crawl, so that I can grasp things and move things around. If I'm able to go through and do these and have healthy environmental opportunities, and my ability to able to assert my autonomy as a young child, then I'm good. But if I have overbearing parents who sort of over control me, don't let me go out and explore and do things, then I'm going to have continued throughout my lifetime problems with struggling with shame and doubt and stuff like that. Okay, so this was the idea behind Erikson's model. But again, the cool thing that he did was took this through the lifespan. So we've got stages at preschool, at elementary, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. So here in the late adulthood, the challenge is, or the milestone is to be able to reflect on my life and sort of achieve this sense of wisdom. If I have a sense of integrity, my life was worth something and meaningful. If it doesn't, if I look back on my life and I say, oh, I didn't do the things I wanted to, that leads to despair, right? And so Erikson's model, interesting, and it takes people sort of recognizing that our continued social development continues on throughout the lifespan and taking this all the way through old adulthood. But again, pretty heavily Freudian theory. It actually looks like it doesn't predict anything or actually work out the way Erikson thought. But we'll give Erikson credit for asking interesting questions and starting to develop something that, even though it wasn't spot on, started to sort of spur research in this area and get people thinking about things in an interesting way. All right, what we are going to spend some time talking about here at the end of this is Kohlberg and Kohlberg's stage theory of moral development. So again, people at this time super jazzed about stage theories, right? And again, this idea that we go through distinct, very identifiable stages as we continue to develop. And so what Kohlberg was interested is how we start to develop sort of moral reasoning. How do we distinguish what's right and wrong in ambiguous situations? How do we start to develop more and more sophisticated ways of thinking about things in ways that are sort of nuanced and sort of teasing apart, some of these moral dilemmas. So again, Kohlberg strongly influenced by Piaget's work, this idea of sort of as we develop, we go through different set stages. And so what Kohlberg's research was interesting in is sort of the way he went about trying to identify changes in people's moral development, or sort of how they sort of reason through things. And so what Kohlberg would do is Kohlberg, in his research, presented kids sort of different ages and adults with an ethical dilemma. Okay, and so I've adjusted this for inflation a little bit, but here's the gist of sort of one of the classic ones. It was called Heinz' Dilemma. Say, Heinz' wife is near death. Her only hope was a drug developed by a local pharmacist. The drug cost $2,000 to make. The pharmacist was selling it for $20,000. Heinz could raise only $100,000. He offered the pharmacist all his savings and promised to pay the rest later. The pharmacist refused, saying he needed to make a profit on his discovery. Heinz became desperate and broke into the store to steal the drug. Should he have done this? Okay, so what Kohlberg was doing was presenting participants with this dilemma, and then asking them, was Heinz right or was Heinz wrong? Okay, and what's interesting is Kohlberg wasn't interested in whether participants felt the behavior was justified or not. So whether or not you said, yeah, he should have done it, or no, he shouldn't have done it, doesn't matter. Kohlberg didn't care about that. What Kohlberg was interested in the reasons, or why people thought that an action was right or wrong. And based on how people reacted to this, or what type of answers they gave, started to identify different sort of in stages of moral development or moral sophistication. Okay, so with Kohlberg's theory, there's 6 different stages that Kohlberg identified. For your purposes, just focus on these big sort of red ones here. So we're going to have 3 of those, and in each main one of the 3 main stages, there are 2 sub-stages. We'll talk about the individual stages, but for your purpose, just focus on sort of the pre-conventional, pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional that we'll go through. Okay, so within Kohlberg's stage theory, what he identified in early childhood were reasonings that indicated what Kohlberg called pre-conventional morality. And when presented with ethical dilemmas, what Kohlberg found was that individuals in this pre-conventional morality stage tended to give egocentric reasons for whether or not Heinz was right or whether or not Heinz was wrong in doing what he did. What we see here that people giving answers that fall along the lines of sort of basic rules. We obey rules to avoid punishment or gain reward, right? So kind of simplistic reasoning. So in stage 1, this idea of obedience and punishment, Kohlberg identified as decisions justified based on knowledge of consequences or punishment. So someone in stage 1 could say, nope, it was wrong for Heinz to steal the drug because it's wrong to steal, and if you steal, you get punished. Or on the opposite, saying, oh yeah, it was fine that Heinz did it because he can take it because he asked first. So some very specific justifications that are based on just very concrete rules. Okay, a little more sophisticated stage 2, individualism exchange. People start to base decisions on personal benefit and gain, but again, still this focus on individual interest. Okay, either saying in stage 2, yeah, it was okay for Heinz to steal the drug because the pharmacist wouldn't give him a fair deal. Okay, well, Heinz wanted it. He tried to sort of talk to the pharmacist. The pharmacist was a jerk, wouldn't give him a fair deal, so that's pharmacist's fault, right? Or say, no, Heinz shouldn't have stole the drug because he could get put in jail for longer than he could stand, right? And so with stage 1 and stage 2, under this pre-conventional morality, what we're seeing is reasoning based on Heinz as Heinz. And Heinz is the only person who, and maybe the pharmacist, who comes into play in the reasoning, right? Heinz isn't recognized as a member of larger society. There's nothing about sort of like, well, people can do this or can't do this. It's all about yes or no. Is this okay or not okay based on sort of my simplistic understanding of rules, and only looks at sort of this egocentric perspective on Heinz as an individual without considering other people. Okay, so this is kind of the reasoning in pre-conventional morality. In early adolescence, again, so this is just rough general sort of age range. What what Kohlberg found were what started to emerge a more involved justifications for whether or not Hines was right or wrong for doing what he did. And what Kohlberg called this phase was conventional morality. Here, what we start to see is the recognition of not just Hines as the only person in the world, but Hines living in a community where there are other people around him, but still some pretty basic sort of justifications based on wanting to gain approval and or to maintain some sort of social order. So in stage 3 of conventional morality, what Kohlberg identified is people making decisions based on social approval. So this good boy, nice girl idea, right? So it was okay for Hines to steal the drug because he loved his wife. Anyone would do that. Anyone would do that. That means if anyone would do it because you love your wife, that people will think you're a good person, and so that's why it's okay to do it. Or stealing could make him a criminal. Criminals are bad. He shouldn't have done it because people don't like criminals, right? So when we start to see the recognition of Hines, not just him and the only person in the universe, but there are other people around who maybe think about or reflect on or impact on his behavior, but we still in stage 3, it's sort of the reasoning is based on what other people are going to think about you, right? Either, yeah, they would do it because people would think that was an impressive thing to do for someone you cared about, or no, they would think you're a criminal and that no one likes a criminal, okay? You get into stage 4, this law and order, we start to see is, again, starting increasing sort of recognition of if we need to have a sort of a positive society, that sort of need to have laws and order. So someone might say in stage 4, it was wrong. People can't just take whatever they want. Or people say, well, he could steal the drug, but he's going to have to face the consequences. So there's recognition that we have rules, and so that behavior, it's important to maintain behavior, to establish rules and things along these lines, okay? So what we see at the conventional morality phase at the conventional morality stage within 3 and 4, a recognition of Hines as part of a community. So it's not just about Hines, and it's not just about the pharmacist, but reasoning based on sort of the context of Hines being a member of larger society and sort of what his behavior means, or what the implications are of Hines' behavior within the context of what other people are going to think about him, or general social contract type of things. Okay. All right. That's where we stopped in lecture, so that's where we'll stop in the video. We'll pick up on Monday with the last post-conventional morality. We'll talk about that and then just get into final lecture slides on gender, sexuality, things like that. All right. Thanks, folks. Sorry we didn't get a recording of the actual lecture, but hopefully this helps get you up to speed. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday. All right. Bye.